Ron Winslow from the Wall Street Journal, and I'm an officer at NASW, and it's my responsibility and privilege to introduce speakers for Track B, which is a wonderfully eclectic group of energy, paleontology, and neuroscience if you stick with us for the whole morning. I have one brief announcement. The tours for Breckenridge Wildlife Center, Wildflower Center, and the labs that are part of the program this afternoon leave right out here, out the door on the left, down the hall there, at about 12:45, and there will be box lunches for you to pick up, I think, on the way out. So our first speaker this morning is from here in Texas at the University of, it's Michael Weber at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm going to betray my non-Texas knowledge and note that how Denise Grady last night in accepting the Cone Award mentioned how you should put aside some of your preconceived notions about stories, make that last phone call and find out something entirely different. And the theme here is clean energy in Texas. And I just was telling Dr. Weber that I've been getting a lot of email lately about algae. I don't really write about energy, so I don't cover that too much, but I'm getting all this email about algae and energy supply, and that's one of several topics that I think he's going to address here. So Dr. Weber is Assistant Professor of Mechanical Engineering here at the University of Texas at Austin, and we'll look forward to his presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll come to the mic in a second. I just want to thank you for the introduction. Russell Gold, the energy writer for the Wall Street Journal, is a local. He's in Austin as well, so it's good to have some interaction with the Wall Street Journal. I've got two handouts to distribute around. One is called Green Star State, which is also the title of the topic today, about how Texas leads the clean energy revolution. This was published in May 2009, this year in Texas Monthly. I don't know if you're familiar with Texas Monthly, but it's one of our local statewide magazines. And there's something to be coming out, so you're getting a sneak peek of Texas, the next solar superpower printout. That will come out in Solar Today, November, December edition. Both these articles make a similar point, which is, I believe, based on the evidence of things that have already occurred, what we expect will happen from my perspective, that Texas will surprise people and lead the green energy transition, as well as the traditional energy supplies, oil and gas. So take one of each, please, and pass it around. So I was playing music before you came in, and I do that. It's sort of a habit I developed. I teach a graduate class, a PhD class, for some awesome undergrads in the spring called Energy, Technology, and Policy. And when I was a new professor a couple of years ago, I'm now a seasoned 3-year veteran. When I first started, I didn't know you were supposed to specify what time you want to teach a class, that if you don't specify, they give you the 8 a.m. slot. So I got Tuesday, Thursday at 8 a.m., and I was sort of bitching and moaning about that at first, and then I realized it's actually fantastic because you get the class done for the day. If I teach in the afternoon, I worry about it all day. So for example, I'm teaching today at 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock, I'm worried all day about my lectures. But if you get it done at 8 a.m., it's done for the day, and then you find that only students who really want to be there bother to show up. So the students who find out it's 8 a.m. don't want to be there, they drop the class immediately. And so you end up getting a self-selected pool of excellent students. But as a way to help wake them up, I play music beforehand to help kind of pep them into the day. So I developed this habit. I took that habit from my graduate class to a freshman seminar I teach. So I also teach freshmen that are still sort of gangly and pimply-faced and fresh out of high school. So basically high schoolers. And I did this last spring. I played music before my lectures, and I played a song by Beyonce. And they were so struck that a professor knew who Beyonce was that it helped my ratings go up, so it was very good. I'm going to start off by playing for you a political ad.
Energy, the future of Texas. We need a governor who will stop Jimmy Carter from holding back on increased production while siphoning off our precious energy resources. I'm Bill Clements. As governor, I won't let the future of Texas become an empty past.
Bill Clements, a great governor for Texas.
Well, I think that kind of sums it up. I could probably stop there, and that would satisfy what you expect of Texas. That was a political ad for the gubernatorial race in 1978. Bill Clements played that ad. That was considered dirty politics in 1978, which I think is sort of amazing. It's how far we've come. As a society, we've made so much progress that we now know what dirty politics really is all about. He was the first Republican elected as governor, basically ever, in 100 years, but first time where it's really openly elected. And he ran on an energy platform, and he ran not against his Democratic gubernatorial opponent, but against Jimmy Carter. He ran against the president, and he ran against Washington, D.C., about how Washington wants to stop Texas from leading on energy, and he won. And it was a big event because Texas historically was a Democratic state, and he was sort of the leading edge of this charge to turn it into a Republican state, which we are for the most part now. You could take the gubernatorial ads from today for Governor Perry or whoever's running. There's a lot of people running. We tend to have many people run in Texas because you don't need a majority. You don't need an absolute majority when you need a plurality. So our governor won with 37% of the vote a couple of years ago, and he's running again. He might win with 25% of the vote this time. And he's running on an energy platform against Washington, D.C. He's trying to ruin our energy industry. In fact, this is the official political position in the state of Texas. Washington, D.C. wants to destroy everything we've come to know and benefit from in Texas. We're an oil and gas economy. We're an energy economy. We make money off this. They're trying to take our money away, and that Washington establishment happens to include his primary opponent, Senator K. Bailey Hutchison. So he sort of wraps this up. He's running against Washington on an energy platform, a traditional energy platform. And this becomes sort of the position of all our statewide office holders, which I think is kind of funny. And I become the token voice who goes around saying the opposite, that a carbon-constrained world is very good for Texas, that we're going to get rich off this, primarily because when it comes to a carbon-constrained world, what the world really wants are low-carbon fuels, wind, solar, natural gas. Well, guess who's got the low-carbon fuels? It's Texas. It's not New Jersey. So this is sort of the hypothesis I go around, and I become sort of a funny, I won't say celebrity, but I'm the go-to guy if you need someone to give you the token opposite voice from what everybody else says. You're going to get some of that today. So let's talk about Texas. Just to give you a sense of what I think is going on, I think there's a rivalry or competition between states, between Texas and other states, especially California, for clean energy leadership. And this comes up in a couple ways. The Economist ran this great feature article about California versus Texas just a few months ago in July. And then yesterday, the New York Times wrote an article about California and Texas, renewable energy's odd couple, how California and Texas lead in clean energy, but through very different motivations and through very different means. California through a regulatory push and a solar and efficiency push, Texas through a deregulatory push and through wind and transmission lines and infrastructure. Different approaches, and we're both leading states for different reasons. So I think this rivalry gets captured in different ways. Definitely California sees itself as a clean energy leader, and Texas finds itself becoming one, whether it meant to or not. I think this rivalry is actually a pretty old one. There's a great writer, I don't know if you've ever heard of T.R. Fehrenbach, who wrote Lone Star State and some other great history books. The difficulties of Texas are not always well understood, he wrote. Texas pioneers battled bandits, dust bowls, and drought, cattle-killing freezes, falling commodity prices, bugs, and bad water, where there was water. Texans remember this, both as triumphs and defeats. They are survivors. The losers died or went to California. This is the Texas attitude. I'm a Texas native. I'm from Austin. I grew up on campus. I'm a faculty brat. My father was a professor here. I went to university here at Texas, and then I went to California for 11 years. So I had the California experience. So I feel comfortable beating up on California. As a Californian, all three of my kids are born in California. We tried to get Texas soil under them when they were born, but we couldn't quite do it. Anyway, there's this long rivalry between Texas and California. We've got a unique attitude. You'll hear this. It's really true. I've lived in Europe. I've lived in California. I've traveled all over the states. I live in Texas. Texas has a unique go-it-alone attitude. Here's Davy Crockett's speech after he lost his final political election. I concluded my speech by telling them that I was done with politics for the present. They might all go to hell, and I would go to Texas. This is before he died, right at the Alamo. But he was this sort of. It's tough to be a Texan sometimes. This is part of the attitude. It shows up in many ways. We've got our own flag in our own country. We're our own republic for 9 years. We fly our flag at the same height as the United States flag. We don't fly below. We fly at the same height because part of the deal of becoming a part of the nation is we can fly our flag at the same height. And we retain the right to secede, supposedly, and we talk about it every once in a while. So Texas is kind of goofy. We're kind of different. And this attitude is shown up with leadership in different ways, one of which is leadership of traditional energy, oil and gas. We're a laggard for modern energy concerns in terms of like greenhouse gas emissions and per capita energy use, things like that. It turns out we're a leader for some green energy issues, whether we meant to be or not. And we're a potential leader for green energy overall. So those are sort of the points of today's talk. Historically, our great natural and geological resources made us a traditional energy leader. We think it's our attitude, we think it's our pluck, and that's part of it, but really we had the resources. We had the oil and gas. We had great famous gushers. He has a picture of Spindletop, which blew January 10th, 1901. What an amazing gusher. This oil coming out changed the balance of world oil production from the Baku region of Russia, or the former Soviet Union, to Texas. This one thing, this one gusher. Then we found the East Texas oil field with about 6 billion barrels, which is the largest of the 48 states. The Permian Basin in West Texas, another 3 billion barrels, both of which combined are about the same size of Alaska's Prudhoe Bay, which is about 10 billion barrels. So we have a lot of oil in Texas historically. We also have natural ports, which worked well with Shell Oil's big innovation about 100 years ago. Almost 100 years ago to the day, they invented the use of oil tankers to move oil around the world, and that worked well with our natural ports. So we developed this ship channel that we deepened, and along it popped up refineries. So Houston and its ports, which are close to the East Texas oil field, worked very well with the global oil market, which was already being developed and had been developed decades before for kerosene. We used to produce petroleum for kerosene for lighting and some heating. We used to use whale oil before that. Whale oil smelled bad, and we were running out of whales. We had peak whale, so to speak. And we went from peak whale, we had oil come along for kerosene. We used to burn off the gasoline because we didn't need it, and then all of a sudden we had internal combustion engines, and gasoline was valuable. So we had people like Rockefeller making a world oil market for kerosene, which then became valuable again for gasoline and diesel and tar and wax and all these other things. So Texas got to benefit from these global events. If you look at our state, there's a couple million holes in the ground for oil and gas, more than any other state by far. We have explored the state far and wide, and we actually keep finding more oil and gas, which is sort of surprising. The green dots are where we had oil wells, and red dots are gas wells. We still have a couple 100,000 active wells today. We still have pump jacks going. We still have gas wells in operation all over the state, except for Austin in the middle. So we have Austin, sort of where the cities are in the middle, but you have sort of a lot of oil and gas in the west and the panhandle, and then on the coastal basins as well. So we just have a lot of stuff. We produced it for years. We also have a lot of coal, actually. And we got a lot of lignite. This map shows in dark gray where the coal is in America, and we tend to think of it with Kentucky and West Virginia, and that's because there's a lot of Appalachian coal. We also tend to think of it with the western low sulfur coal up near Wyoming with Powder River Basin. We actually have a lot of lignite in Texas too. Now lignite's a crappy coal. It's kind of like dirt. You don't really want to burn it unless you have to, but we have a lot of it. So this is sort of an interesting conundrum because we tend to be rich in oil, gas, and coal. And then we have our own grid. There are 3 grids in America, East, West, and Texas. And it's not exactly Texas. It's ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. We miss El Paso and slices of the Panhandle, but by sort of historical circumstance, we are not regulated by the federal authorities for our grid. We can play with our grid our own way, which gives us freedom to implement novel market mechanisms or regulatory regimes or costs or things like that. So we can do things with our grid that other people cannot do. And this shows up with things we're trying to do with wind and transmission lines that other states just cannot do, but we have the freedom to. We make a lot of money from this. The energy industry has been very good for Texas. We have weathered the recession better than any other state. We've actually added jobs in Austin and some other cities in Texas. We are okay with our budgets. We're not laying off government employees. Our university here at UT, I had a pay freeze at 0%. That's fine because University of California faculty are being sort of forced with summer vacations or furloughs. We're in a great position as a university, as a state, because of this energy industry. The high energy prices helped kick off this recession. Well, that was good for Texas. We made a lot of money off all of you, so thank you very much. This is good news for us in many ways. The total revenues to the state, actually, the state government makes money off of this. It makes billions of dollars off of natural gas production and off of oil production and off of land income from all the land the states own, they lease to other producers. And the total government budget is 85, 90 billion, of which some fraction, 4 or 5 billion, come from the energy industry, plus all the subsequent sales taxes and property taxes. There are many other taxes that show up in revenue streams from the oil and gas industry. What's interesting is that we're happy to tax oil and gas production, but California does not. And I find this fascinating. I was out in California about a year and a half ago, giving a similar kind of talk. I love to go to California and give talks about how they think they're going to lead clean energy. Really, it's going to be Texas, and I do it just to be provocative. And at the time, this is right when the proposition was being voted on about whether California should tax oil production in the state. And the energy industry spent something like $100 million to defeat it because it would have meant a couple $2 billion a year in tax revenue for California. And so I wrote an op-ed that never got published, but I thought it was sort of made the point. Even tax-hating Texas taxes mineral wealth extraction. Almost every state does. California is one of the few that doesn't. This is what states do. It's like, all right, you want to take our wealth from out of the ground, that's fine, but you have to give us a fee so we can use that money to reward the state and the citizens for it. So we tax oil 4.6% of its market value, and if we produce billions and billions of dollars of oil and gas each year, you tend to extract that value. We tax gas at a higher rate, natural gas. I'm not sure why, and the natural gas people aren't happy about that. If you do enhanced oil recovery, where you actually flood your oil reserves with CO2 to get more oil out of the ground, your tax rate's lower. So we encourage enhanced oil recovery as a way to incentivize or foster increased oil production in Texas. So we tax it. We make money off of it. The University of Texas, the campus you're sitting on, has derived much of its wealth from oil. Oil was discovered on university lands. It was kind of a funny deal. We got a lot of coastal land, the University of Texas, but it was decided to be too valuable, so in exchange they gave us West Texas land that no one wanted, and it turned out to have oil and gas on it. So this was great for Texas. Santa Rita number 1, a well that struck oil, is actually on campus right next to the swim center. So if you want to go see the actual well that struck oil in the 1920s, you'll see it's obviously an important part of our history. We made a lot of money off of this. We had set up something called a permanent university fund in the late 1800s to handle royalties from state lands for state education, and it's set up so that 2/3 of all royalties go to the University of Texas, 1/3 goes to Texas A&M, and 0 goes to Texas Tech and the University of Houston. These are the 4 public universities in Texas, and this is a very bitter point for these other universities, that the University of Texas has gotten the lion's shares of the royalties. But because of the PUF, we call it, the Permanent University Fund, and all these lands with oil and gas production, UT has traditionally had among the largest of all university endowments in the nation. It goes usually something like this: Harvard, Yale, Stanford, UT. It's by far the largest endowment of any public university because we have all this oil and gas well. Now, it turns out those same lands are in places where there's lots of wind, so maybe we can do it again, but in a non-depleting way. We maintain strong ties to oil and gas industry here at UT. The CEOs and presidents of ExxonMobil, Shell, ConocoPhillips, they're all UT alumni. We produce the people who then go run these companies, and then they stay in touch and recruit our students. We have the number 1 rated petroleum engineering department in the nation, and it's been that way forever. And then we have people like John and Catherine Jackson, who gave a couple $100 million to form the Jackson School of Geosciences. So we remain connected today to the oil and gas industry. This is both good news and bad news. It means we're essentially the biggest energy university in the world. We do more energy-related research than MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, you name it. We do a lot of energy-related research. No one knows it. The energy industry knows it, but the academic and governmental establishments don't really know it. But that's almost all old energy. And so as people like me come along and try to recruit and brand us as a new energy university, we have this legacy which helps us, but also hurts us. We have the Texas Railroad Commission. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Railroad Commission. It was the world's first oil cartel, sort of a funny commission. It was established in 1891 by Governor Hogg, a UT alum. We have a Hogg auditorium on campus, and he had a daughter named Ima Hogg. I'm not kidding. He named her Ima. It was originally chartered to handle capital-intensive interstate commerce at the nexus of federal and state governments, so it looked at railroads, because railroads were the vehicles through which interstate commerce occurred. And it eventually regulated the energy industry because energy became an interstate commodity. The irony is, a few years ago, this Texas legislature took railroads out of their purview. So the Railroad Commission regulates energy, but does not regulate railroads for whatever reason. It, for a long time, was the most powerful local government agency in the world. Its heydays was 1930s or 1940s through the 1960s, where it was eventually superseded by OPEC. So before OPEC, we had the Railroad Commission. OPEC came along in 1972, after Texas peak production of oil occurred, OPEC became the reigning oil administrator for prices worldwide. What we have with the Railroad Commission is they would actually set production rates and prices and quotas for Texas producers. And they did it to stabilize markets. Who likes the boom and bust? Let's have a stable price that we can all be happy with. And so they would set this price, and in collusion with Louisiana and Oklahoma, by setting that price, basically set world oil price. So the Railroad Commission was actually better at being an oil cartel than OPEC was. We had better pricing control in Texas than OPEC ever had. One of the main things was they were worried about hot oil, independents producing above their quotas, which is the same challenge OPEC has when one of their member countries produces more than they're supposed to. They were also worried about angular drilling, where you drill an angle below your neighbor's property and take their oil, which is illegal. But in Texas, we have the rule of capture. You can drill straight down, and you can take as much oil from your land as you want, and if the oil from your neighbor's land happens to flow into your reservoir in the process and up your pipe, so be it. That's the way it works in Texas. It's an old common law from the 1200s in England, this rule of capture, and we use it for oil and gas production in Texas as well as water production. And this gives us an encouragement to produce as much as you can before your neighbor gets it. So we have this race going on. But this is something the Railroad Commission has dealt with historically and still deals with today. We still have energy commerce is active and alive. We got the headquarters, a lot of big energy companies. We got a lot of collection of expertise. We got Houston. We still have Houston. So energy commerce is still a big piece of what's going on. We remain the nation's largest producer of oil, gas, wind, and electricity. Our 26 petroleum refineries can process nearly 5 million barrels per day of crude. That's about a fourth of the nation's total capacity. And the Baytown refinery that ExxonMobil owns is the single largest refinery in the nation. So we're a major energy producer still today. We're also a major energy consumer. We're the largest consumer of oil, gas, coal, wind, and electricity. Most people don't know we're the largest consumer of coal in the nation. I don't know who else would be. I guess Ohio or some Midwestern state or something, some eastern state. Even though we're not a major coal producer, we are a major coal consumer. And this leads to us being considered a laggard by most modern energy priorities. We're the leading energy consumer by far in the U.S., by far. But we consume about 50% more energy than second place, California. We're the leading CO2 emitter in the U.S. And California's got a much bigger population, by the way. California has 50% more people. We consume 50% more energy. So we're very energy intensive. We're the leading CO2 emitter in the U.S. About 11.5% of U.S. carbon emissions come from Texas. We're about 2.5% of global carbon emissions. So if you list all the countries in the world and their CO2 emissions in millions of metric tons, you have China, United States, Russia, India, Japan, Germany. Texas would be 7th on the list, ahead of Canada, and close to Germany. Think of how many people Germany has compared to Texas. So we're a big emitter. In United Kingdom is what, 60 million people? Texas is 24 million people. If you lay it out, the total annual energy consumption in the U.S. is 100 quadrillion BTU. A BTU is a British thermal unit. 1 BTU is about the energy in a kitchen match. A quadrillion is a million billion. So we consume 100 million billion kitchen matches of energy a year in the U.S., 12.4 quads of which are consumed in Texas. The annual energy consumption per capita is about 340 million BTU per person in the U.S. In Texas, it's 560 million BTU. So we in Texas consume 60% more energy per person than the typical American, who consumes twice as much energy as a typical British person, who consumes twice as much energy as the typical global citizen. So Texans consume about 8 times more energy per person per year than the typical global citizen, or the typical Chinese person, perhaps. So we're a big energy consumer. We also emit a lot of stuff. This is a million metric tons of carbon. I showed on the prior slide CO2, which is a slightly different measure. We also have a lot of wind. So of the 25 gigawatts of wind in the U.S., 9 gigawatts are in Texas. We don't have much solar despite our capacity. We still produce a significant fraction of the oil in America, and we consume a lot. We are not self-sufficient on oil in Texas. We consume more than we produce, and this started happening a couple of decades ago. So we consume a lot of energy. One of the main reasons we consume so much is because we have a very energy-intensive industry. The left panel shows Texas energy consumption by sector, and the right panel shows USA energy consumption by sector. If you start by looking at the USA, you'll see that the energy apportionment is roughly equal, not exactly, between residential, commercial, transportation, and industry. Industry is the biggest consumer, but not much bigger than transportation, and then you see residential and commercial still consume a lot. We'll look at Texas. More than half our energy consumption is just for industry. We have such an energy hog here because we have cement, we have petrochemical, we have products, we have manufacturing. We're the China of America. We're the dirty industrial heavy lifter. And so as a consequence, we consume a lot of energy that other states don't consume. We also are individually profligate. We drive large cars long distances. We also have large homes that we air condition in the summer. So we individually spend a lot of energy in the residential sector, but then we have a very energy intensive industrial sector. So that's sort of the backdrop for where we are and how we got here and what our situation is in Texas. Given all that, despite all that, or maybe because of all of it, I think Texas can lead the green energy revolution for a variety of reasons. First of all, we've got the renewable resources. We've got more combined wind and solar than anybody else. We have the opportunity to do next generation biofuels. We have an opportunity to lead on plug-in hybrids. We lead the world in carbon capture and sequestration. And we also are leading some of the innovations on the smart grid. And I'll go through each of these one by one. And I think the slides will be available for all of you who are industriously taking notes. You take notes with better fervor than my students, and I appreciate that.
Where would those slides be?
I gave them to somebody. They can be mailed out. I gave them to somebody, and therefore they exist somewhere, but I'm not sure exactly. I can email them if for any reason you can't get them. All right. This is a map, a rough map of Texas renewable energy resources. On the left is biomass. We have very piney woods, wooded lands on the eastern half of the state. If you've never been to Houston, Houston starts to look sort of like Alabama. A lot of piney woods, a lot of forests, a lot of biomass, a lot of paper companies there, a lot of lumber companies. Then you go up to the Panhandle, we start to get some grasses and manure from feedlots. So we got biomass up in the Panhandle as well. Solar potential in the west is fantastic. Not quite as good as Arizona, but pretty darn good. Then we have wind. We got great wind on the coast and in the Panhandle and out in the west. And if you add this all up, this chart on the right shows the total renewable energy potential for different states that were summed up. Texas is number one, ahead of Montana, Kansas, and the Dakotas and all these other things. The Dakotas have better wind, but less sun and less biomass. The biomass, by the way, is pretty small compared to the wind and solar for total resource. So it just works out by good fortune that we tend to have better solar and wind. Now, Arizona and Nevada have great solar, but they don't have the wind. So we just have good fortune. that we have renewable resources here. And I see a parallel where, just as in the 1930s during a global economic recession, people were getting rich in Texas. We were minting billionaires and millionaires in Texas in the 1930s with an energy transition. I think we can do it again with this global recession. And there'll be the same ingredients. We've got the people, we've got the land, we've got the resources. It makes it much easier. Yes, ma'am.
But you didn't have to overturn an existing industry in the first example you're using.
There was energy consumption, so the question was, but we didn't have to overturn with the prior transition existing industry. That makes it both easier and harder, so there are benefits and drawbacks to that. There was a prior energy consumption that was wood and cow dung and straw and things like that, and kerosene for heating and lighting, and coal. And then oil and gas came along and displaced that. So there was an existing infrastructure, but it wasn't nearly as extensive. It was much simpler to displace prior energy consumption with the new energy consumption, especially because oil and gas were such better performers than straw and dung, things like that. This one's going to be trickier because you do have trillions of dollars of installed assets and vested interests in place that you have to displace. But you don't have to displace them necessarily. You might just partner with them. And so they might say, yeah, come along, we'll help you do all this. We've got the pipelines, the refineries. So you're starting to see majors like ExxonMobil invest hundreds of millions of dollars in new biofuels because they can blend those biofuels and put it into their pipelines, refineries more easily. So this installed asset base, it might be a hurdle or a barrier, but it might be a partnering opportunity. We're not sure how it'll play out. It's looking more and more like a partnering opportunity as these big energy industries are starting to look aggressively at these options. AEP, the biggest coal emitter in the nation, American Electric Power, is doing the largest demonstration of carbon capture and sequestration. ExxonMobil's got some of the largest investments in biofuels, along with BP and Shell and all the others, working with Verenium and other companies to look at biofuels. So we're starting to see Florida Power and Light install huge wind farms. So it's not clear to me how this plays out, but it might actually be a partnering opportunity. Texas also has vast geothermal resources. Geothermal tends to historically be very good in the West, so California has more geothermal potential and install capacity than any other state, along with Wyoming and the geysers and all these sort of places near tectonic activity. But it turns out Texas has pretty good geothermal resources in our oil and gas wells. We've got millions of holes in the ground. We can use them to generate heat, actually. So we have a good opportunity here. We have good coastal resources. In fact, the state government's already issued its first lease for 11,000 acres along the coast to do geothermal production. So we have some opportunity here for geothermal as well that's starting to pick up some speed. And then we mentioned algae. Algae is a next generation biofuel that's very interesting. I've got several researchers in my group, several students looking at this pretty aggressively. We're on a part of a big project for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, to develop jet fuels from algae. And we're in production right now on campus, actually. What's interesting about algae is it only needs three things to grow, and that's bad water, sunlight, and CO2, and Texas has all three. So this works really well. Algae likes the bad water because it actually cleans up the water and uses the nutrients to grow. We got lots of CO2, as I mentioned, so we can use the CO2 as an asset, and we got lots of great sunlight. And we also have a lot of land that no one wants, so we can build these big algae ponds. So this is potentially very promising. We might be able to produce, it's hard to confirm these numbers, but our preliminary analysis indicates that there's a couple billion gallons a year of lipids we could produce, which are the fats in algae, of which maybe some fraction you could turn into fuels. So we're talking about billions of gallons a year of fuels from algae at a couple dollars per gallon. Ends up being a multi-billion or tens of billions of dollars per year market just in Texas alone. So this is substantial. To give you a sense of scale, we consume about 140 billion gallons a year of gasoline in the nation in a year, and about 40 billion gallons a year of diesel, and about 10 to 20 billion gallons a year of jet fuel. So there's an opportunity here. Yes, ma'am.
So some commercial ventures that are attempting to develop algae biofuels up in Massachusetts have recently gone under. What is your feeling on the reason for that, and how do you hope to avoid some pitfalls?
There's a lot of biofuels companies going out of business right now. We see a lot of it in corn ethanol, especially, and some in cellulosic, and now we're starting to see it in algae. The reason companies go under is, there are a couple of reasons. One is oftentimes they overclaim. We see this a lot in renewable energy. We see a lot of hype, a lot of overclaim. And if you overclaim, then you raise money from investors, you overpromise. And then when you overpromise and you underdeliver, the investors don't give you follow-on funding. So that's one scenario. I'm not sure for the particular one you're mentioning what the case is. Sometimes it turns out they just can't do it. There are many different approaches to making biofuels. You can do thermochemical approaches and biochemical and fermentation routes, and within biochemical you can have sort of catalytic approaches and non-catalytic approaches. You could have sort of a bacteria approach, a yeast approach, or even a fungus approach. There are all these approaches. And there's a race to see which one wins. Maybe their approach just didn't work. It's hard. or maybe it works but at the wrong price point, or with a global economic recession, it's hard to convince people to buy algae-based fuels at $400 a gallon when everyone else pays $2.50 a gallon. So there's a variety of reasons why it might fail, and the race continues. A couple big companies are still investing hundreds of millions of dollars, like ExxonMobil and synthetic genomics, and Sapphire Energy also has some money. So there's still money to be had for people who have good ideas or a good sales pitch, whatever it is. I think the proof's in the pudding. We'll see how it goes. It's going to take a while to really determine this. But I think there's reason for optimism, but we're not done yet. There's no way. It's not there. What I think is interesting about UT in Texas is that we have this great resource that's good for algae. We also have the nation's largest repository or library of algae, the largest culture collection, UTEX, which has been funded by NSF for decades. So we happen to have the world's greatest collection of algae and algae experts in one half of the campus. In the other half of the campus, we have the world's greatest collection of fuels engineers. And we finally married them up 2 years ago and got the fuels people together with the algae people and said, hey, let's make fuels from algae. Okay, so we're teamed up. This is great. We're not a corn kind of university. We're not a biofuels or agro fuels kind of university, but we do know algae, so this is sort of interesting. In fact, we have algae ponds in place. We're actually doing production today. We can also enable plug-in hybrids. I think this is an interesting story. Plug-in hybrids and electrified transportation is good for a whole host of reasons. One of the reasons is transportation and oil are highly coupled. 95% of our energy for transportation comes from petroleum. This is a monopoly, essentially. And we're trying to break that monopoly onto other things, and if you electrify transportation, you get onto electricity, which is diversified. Electricity comes from coal, natural gas, nuclear, wind, hydro, you name it. So there's not a monopoly of fuels for electricity. And so by electrifying transportation, you displace petroleum, you diversify the fuels, and then you achieve some environmental benefits where it's much easier to scrub emissions at about 1,500 power plant smokestacks than it is to scrub emissions at 200 million auto tailpipes. So there's some advantage there. Well, a lot of people claim that the main difference that's going to enable plug-in hybrids is a lithium-ion battery. Well, who invented that? A professor of mechanical engineering here at UT, a colleague of mine. He just won at the White House the Enrico Fermi Award. He was there 10 days ago receiving it from President Obama. Then we have Austin Energy, who many people point to as a leader for this. We've got this funny utility, Austin Energy, a municipally owned utility that's under our control. And because it's under our control, it responds to political will and popular will. And there's a lot of popular will in Austin to do green things, even if they're expensive, which gives political will, which means the utility does it. And because they're municipally owned, they can do things that lose money because they're achieving some other philosophical mission. Well, they started this campaign a few years ago, plug-in partners, to get people to agree to buy power from 8,000 plug-in hybrids that they would buy from them if people signed up to buy them. And then Roger Duncan, our CEO, went to all these car companies years ago and said, your business model sucks. Oil's going to get more expensive. You should consider electrifying. Why don't you work with this? And all the car companies said, nah, we're fine. We like our business model. And he's like, all right. So he left, and they went out of business, and now they're talking electric. So I think this is sort of interesting. But a lot of people point to Austin Energy as a leader in this. Roger Duncan, the CEO or the general manager of Austin Energy, was featured in Business Week 2005 as one of the 20 most important people for greenhouse gas reductions. He was number 13, right next to Arnold Schwarzenegger on the list for some of these initiatives. And then in March, National Geographic did a big feature on energy efficiency, and they included Roger Duncan, a big picture of him in there, because you can't write a story about energy efficiency without talking about Roger Duncan. So there's this funny mix of personalities in Texas that contributes to this story. And I don't mean this to be completely a sales pitch. There's actually science in here as well. But I think there's a surprising confluence of personalities and capabilities. Then we have this irony of all ironies that Exxon leads the world in carbon separation. This is an article from Wall Street Journal. Exxon could benefit from emissions work, it says, from about 10 months ago. The company spent the last 2 decades forging expertise in the key technology to capture and store carbon dioxide. In fact, their facility in Wyoming has captured more carbon than any facility in North America. In the demand for CO2, they say, for enhanced oil recovery, for increasing oil production, outstrips current supply. So the irony is that ExxonMobil spent years fighting climate legislation, yet they actually hold some of the key patents and are going to make money off of this. ExxonMobil always makes money off of everything. When we had a lot of emissions work be done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, people claimed they fought it, and they had the key patents for scrubbing NOx, or nitrogen oxides, out of our power plants. So when it came time to scrub that out of power plants, guess who made money? ExxonMobil and their patents. They got great engineers, they come up with great inventions, and they make money coming and going, it turns out. So they have this capability. They're a Texas company. And then we have some legislation on the books. We actually have legislation on the books in Texas to encourage a carbon industry. We pioneered the use of CO2 injection for enhanced oil recovery in the 1970s. We have injected more carbon into the ground than any other place in the world. We know more about this than anybody around. We've been doing it for decades. So we have regulatory conditions in place to avoid blowouts and to avoid underground environmental impact. We know how to regulate CO2 storage underground because we've been doing it. In fact, that's one of UT's main contributions to the field, is understanding how CO2 enhances the oil recovery and how it stores or doesn't. And so we have this weird situation in Texas where we actually have more buyers of CO2 than sellers. More people want to pay for CO2 and put it in the ground than there are people who have the CO2. So we've got this preposterous situation where we have natural geologic reserves of CO2 in New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, and Colorado that's been there for millions of years, and we drill down and we punch a hole in it, we let it out, and we take it in a pipe a couple hundred miles to Texas, put it back in the ground. And this kind of freaks people out that we're emitting billions of tons of CO2 in one part of the nation. At the same time, we're releasing it from the ground to put it in the ground for another part. Why not just take the smokestack CO2, put it in the ground, and leave the natural CO2 there? These geologic reserves of CO2 are sort of interesting. They are one of the reasons we believe sequestration could work, because nature has done it for us. Nature gives us examples that geologic sequestration of CO2 can last for millions of years. So this is very encouraging. We just have to replicate what nature does. So we have this situation where we have people who want CO2 and are willing to pay for it, and we have people who emit CO2 who don't want to and are about to pay for it through carbon legislation. And so a bill was brought in 2007 in the legislative session. I don't know if you know much about the carnival we call the legislature in Texas. It meets every 2 years. It meets for about 5 months. I think our legislators are paid like $150 a month. So they all have real jobs outside of the legislature, and they drop the jobs for 5 months, and they come to town to do legislative action. So we have biannual budgets. We have 2-year budgets. We have 2-year missions. And then it's a short legislative action, so not much gets done. Although sometimes things get really done. And then it all happens like in the last week. We had major carnivals the last 2 legislative sessions where things got shut down for voter ID bills and things like that. Things that had nothing to do with the legislation, but politics really got in the way. We had this bill that actually became law in 2007, intended to kickstart a carbon capture and storage or sequestration industry in Texas, where I gave a tax break. We already have a tax break on the books if you do enhanced oil recovery. But if you enhance that oil recovery with anthropogenic CO2, you get an additional tax break. So we have a law in the books incentivizing the use and capture of anthropogenic CO2, and it works out to be a couple dollars per ton of CO2 tax advantage. So if you're a big emitter of CO2 and you have to pay $20 a ton for your emissions, and you have a buyer willing to pay you $10 a ton that offsets your cost if you can capture that CO2, well, now that buyer can pay $2 more per ton from your smokestack as opposed to from the natural reserves in Colorado. So it's a market mechanism. What I like is actually built on the LBJ School of Public Affairs student research. And the irony of all ironies is that it'd be funny to me if Texas leapfrogged the world with its carbon market by putting together sellers and buyers as opposed to imposing a regime on the top. We'll see. We might have both, actually.
Are the reservoirs for putting the CO2 in the ground on the same scale and order of magnitude as what would come out of a, say, coal-fired power plant in the course of a year?
That's a great question. How much can we store in these oil reservoirs versus what we actually emit in the nation? And the scale is off by a couple orders of magnitude. So it's smaller. So the amount of CO2 you could store in the oil reservoirs is enough to make a difference, but not enough to solve it. It's enough to count. And the way most people sort of see it is it's a way to get the industry going, to get the pipelines in place, get the infrastructure going, because the price points make more sense for enhanced oil recovery. And then this gets you, say, hundreds of millions of tons stored. But then if you want to get to billions of tons, you got to go to deeper saline aquifers or sandstone. You have to go to different places underground. So it's really a way to get things rolling. But there's enough there that we care. It's interesting, but not enough to get us all the way there. Great question. There are other signs that Texas can become a green energy leader. We emit less carbon per kilowatt hour of electricity than most states. Our grid is less carbon intensive than most grids. Now, we consume more electricity than everyone else, but per unit we emit less carbon than most people. We also emit less carbon per gallon of refined product than most states because we have very efficient refineries. And then we have some other green energy firsts that I'll go through. First of all, looking at the grid, the Texas grid is the upper left and the U.S. grid's in the lower right. The U.S. grid is half coal, very little oil. It's half coal, it's about a fifth natural gas, a fifth nuclear, then a lot of hydro and other things. Petroleum is tiny. So we used to have about 17% of our electricity in the nation was from petroleum. Then we had the energy crisis in the 70s and people said, forget it, electricity is too valuable. We need to get it off oil. So we've dialed the oil back and replaced it with natural gas, coal, and nuclear. But coal still remains half of our mix in America. If you look at Texas, about 10% of the electricity in the nation is generated in Texas. We're half natural gas instead of half coal. So we are less carbon intensive per per megawatt hour or per kilowatt hour than the national grid. About 36% coal, only 10% nuclear. We have much less nuclear than the national average, although we're about to double our nuclear capacity in Texas if the permits to build new nuclear reactors get issued and they're actually constructed and go along. That purple is wind. We have 4% of our electricity in Texas from wind, so we do much better on wind than most states. So we actually have a pretty good grid from diversity and carbon intensity. We also had the first comprehensive municipal green building program in America, established a couple decades ago by Austin Energy to help reduce energy consumption of buildings following the California model. The thing California did really well was establish strict building codes for energy efficiency that levelized their demands for energy per capita over time. And PBS, when they wanted to do a series, an episode of this old house, and they wanted to do a green remodel, they came to Austin to do it for a reason. And just a plug for my brother, David Weber, who's the architect who did that. He's a green architect in town. We actually had a little competition to see who can get on PBS first. And I was on first like by a week before him. I was on for like 30 seconds, and he was on for the whole season, but I still declare I won. We have other leadership credentials. We had the first real rigorous RPS, or Renewable Portfolio Standard, and we're now looking at a federal RPS, although the term of art has changed because portfolio is bad because that means financial collapse, so now it's a Renewable Electricity Standard. So you might have seen it's gone from an RPS to an RES. Anyway, Texas had one in 1999 under Governor Bush. We had a requirement for a certain amount of capacity to be installed. I gave a talk to some members of Parliament from the UK. They established their equivalent of an RPS in 2002, and I made fun of them for being so many years behind Dirty Texas, and this was very offensive to them. They were very upset. Anyway, as a consequence, we are now the #1 state for solid wind capacity. We had the nation's first Clean Energy Incubator and a couple other things. I got to pick up the pace to give you some time for questions. What I like about because I've been going too slow so far, but you know what I find is people learn to listen quickly. They just sort of dial in. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it. When we passed the RPS in 1999, this is Governor Bush and the legislature at the time. It was a two-part deal. It was a Texas two-step. One is we're going to have a requirement for renewable energy, renewable power, I should say, really. And secondly, we're going to do some market deregulation. We're going to do some market competition. And so we did both at the same time. And we had these requirements. In 1999, we passed a requirement that by 2003, we'd have 400 megawatts of renewable power installed, increasing to 2,000 megawatts by 2009. So we gave ourselves 10 years to install 2,000 megawatts of renewable power. And it wasn't specified whether it be wind, solar, geothermal. The markets will decide, but you have to have a certain amount of power installed. If you look over in the farthest right column, this shows what actually was installed in terms of wind. And by 2003, we were already halfway towards the 2009 mark, and we're whipping along, making great progress. Wind just needed a little nudge to take off because it was actually at a pretty good price point. And then in 2005, the legislature met again and said that was too easy, let's make it tougher. Let's come up with a 5,000 megawatt target by 2015. So they gave another 10-year ramp, but raise it from 2,000 to 5,000 megawatts. And Texas started humming along. By the end of this year, we'll actually have 9,000 megawatts installed with another couple thousand megawatts on the books under development, with another 44,000 megawatts under consideration right now. This is more wind than some countries have of all sorts of power. This is a phenomenal zooming success. And if you look at the chart of installed wind power in gigawatts, which is 1,000 megawatts on the left, over a year, you see basically the RPS that passed in 1999, it just kicked off this exponential growth curve. It is going to slow down a little bit next year because now we're ahead of the transmission capability. We need more transmission capacity to get more wind built. But then it will take off again. It's a moneymaker for Texas. We now have a boost from new transmission lines. This is a map of the top 7/8 of Texas and some CREZ zones, competitive renewable energy zones. This is sort of a Texas term and Texas phrase. It's not getting picked up as a model for how to get things done. Where because we have our own grid, we can just build more transmission and we don't have to ask for permission. Yes, sir? The ERCOT boundary is about where the CREZ zones are. So the CREZ zones are mostly within ERCOT, not exactly. So you get up to the top of the state, parts of these CREZ zones are in the Southwest Power Pool, some other part, but all of these western ones are within ERCOT. So we have ERCOT, which is the grid, and then we have PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, which manages the utilities and power plants. PUC covers all of Texas. ERCOT covers 85% of Texas. So to talk about this, it's easiest for us to build the transmission lines within ERCOT. We have more dominion, but we can still build them to other sections. In fact, there was an article just a couple days ago, I want to say New York Times, I can't remember, about this superstation in New Mexico where the east, west, and Texas grids will all connect, and that'll make it easier for us to get power to flow around. This is a big deal because Kansas and other states have great wind, and they're just not building wind turbines. And I don't know why. They're missing out on billions of dollars. They're just not building it. They don't have the transmission lines. They don't want it. And so Texas says, okay, we'll build it, but we got to get the power from us to Boston, or we can't really do there, but say St. Louis or Denver. And we're having trouble doing it because we don't have the power lines. But in Texas, we're building more power lines. We've agreed to spend billions of dollars, $5 to $12 billion, to build another, say, 10 gigawatts of capacity out to West Texas just to enable wind. And we have great solar resources out there as well. So once you have the transmission lines for wind, you can bring the solar online. So we basically, while the government in the federal level is really struggling to get transmission lines built, it's very hard for the federal government to build transmission lines because you hit a state boundary. And the minute you crow from Kansas to Missouri, you have to talk to Missouri people. And it's really hard because there's so many states and so many groups, and there are all these federal lands. There's all these reasons why it's hard for the federal government to build transmission lines. When a lot of people see this as the great enabler of renewable resources. If you just had the transmission lines, we could have the wind and solar and geothermal. The problem with renewable resources, they tend to be where the people are not. So you have this separation, this diffusivity, the sprawl of energy, where it is different than where the load centers are. And so transmission lines are a huge problem, but we happen to have, by historical fluke, fewer of these regulatory hurdles. And so we can just build them. And then the greatest irony, this is the joke that we play on everybody, is we socialize the cost. We're socialist with our grid in Texas. We charge everybody the same amount to connect their grid, their power plant to the grid. Whether you're a coal plant near Houston or you're a small wind farm in West Texas, it's postage stamp pricing. It's the same price for everybody, no matter how far the electrons flow or where you are. We spread the cost of hooking up renewable power to everybody. This is about as socialist as you get. It's been hugely successful for us. Yes, ma'am. Is there any effort at all to use the energy closest to where it's produced? That's been historically been the way we do it. We have the power plants closer to the cities, the power plants on the eastern half of Texas where the population is. With renewables, that's trickier because, yeah, we're using it from, we move hundreds of miles. It's trickier with renewables because they're less dense than the traditional forms, so you need more area. The amount of energy you can get per acre with wind and solar is much lower than per acre of coal, oil, gas, or nuclear. So it takes more acres, and those acres tend to be available elsewhere. The resource tends to be available elsewhere. Historically, people don't live where it's windy unless you're Scottish. Only the Scots live where it's windy. In fact, there's a joke, I think it's at Shetland Isles off the north part of Scotland, that one day the wind stopped and everybody fell down because they've been walking like this, for so long. So we tend not to live where it's windy. We do live where it's sunny more and more over time, so we can actually generate solar right where we are on our rooftops. But the geothermal resources, a lot of the resources are just further away and take more area, which is part of the challenge. So you're talking pipelines or transmission lines. Yes?
Given the grid that you have shown, could you talk about sort of the failure of the Pickens plan in the panhandle over there? And
the failure, that's because I'm not sure it's a failure, the Pickens plan, but
in terms of his promises and speed.
The promises and speed. So T-Boone Pickens is really amazing. I gave a talk on Friday on energy leadership, and I asked the crowd to begin with, if you think of energy leaders, who do you think of? And I would think of like Thomas Edison or Westinghouse or Tesla, and a lot of people are like Obama or Bush, or T-Boone Pickens' name came up a lot as energy leader because he's changed the debate on energy. And do we have a hard stop in 3 minutes, or can I go a little late? What's the... 5 more, I guess. 5 more, okay. T-Boone Pickens is hilarious. I'm on the Electric Utility Commission in Austin. I'm one of the regulators for our local utility, and as a consequence of that role, I go to a lot of town hall meetings to hear what the people think about what Austin should do with its energy mix. And they'll say, we need more renewables. Why are you so slow? Tear down the coal plant. And then you hear people say, we need to make it cheaper. So you hear every kind of opinion that's possible out there. And I had one guy, after 2 hours of presentation, stand up and say, I got 2 words for you, T-Boone Pickens. And I remember thinking, yeah. Maybe T-Boone's one word. The Pickens plan is twofold. He says, let's use a lot more wind for electricity. And as a consequence of using more wind, we can free up some natural gas. Let's use that natural gas for transportation to displace petroleum. So it's a 2-part step. Let's use wind for electricity to free up gas for transportation. And that makes perfect sense for a lot of reasons. He doesn't say who pays. Who pays for the transmission lines or the pipelines and that kind of thing. So there's a mystery there, but it's a good idea and it makes perfect sense from the engineer's perspective. Then he promised to build the world's largest wind farm, and he even bought the turbines. And the news came out that he's delayed that. He's having trouble getting financing. I don't know if you noticed that banks don't really lend money anymore. I don't know what banks do, actually. They used to lend money. They don't do that anymore. So he's having trouble getting financing. And one of the reasons is because the transmission lines aren't built yet. He needs these transmission lines. And the other reason is natural gas prices are really low. And natural gas prices set the marginal electricity price in Texas and also in other parts of the nation. So in an era where it's hard to get a loan and natural gas prices are low, you can't build. So he's on delay right now. I don't think he's stopped. He says, I'm not stopping, I'm just on delay. So we'll see. Let me run ahead. There's also a smart grid deployment going on in Austin. We call it Pecan Street Project. It's about 1.5 years old now. It just got formalized as a not-for-profit about 1.5 months ago. It has the City of Austin, Austin Energy, the Incubator, Environmental Defense Fund, the Chamber of Commerce. I love seeing those two groups side by side. And the University of Texas, who founded this to reinvent the grid. And we brought on a lot of corporate partners whose names you recognize. The smart grid is a big buzz nationwide. We have more going on with smart grid in Austin than anywhere else, and it's kind of funny because no one knows about it. There are articles about Miami and Boulder because they put up 50 smart meters. Austin's almost done installing its 300,000 smart meters this month. Full rollout. Every customer in Austin Energy now has a smart meter. The Blue Bonnet Co-op, 80,000 customers just east of Austin, same thing. North Texas, competitive markets, they have a similar kind of rollout. We have more smart meters here than just about anywhere. So we have this funny opportunity. And then we have these other goals with Austin and the Pecan Street Project to add a couple hundred megawatts of new distributed solar and reduce the need for energy through conservation efficiency to avoid another power plant, and then create these two-way flows of information and power by making Austin an actual clean energy laboratory. And this is all underway. We got things going on. So I think this is very interesting. And I'll just sort of close it there, that my main point, my hypothesis, and this is what I go around talking about and testifying about, is that Texas can and will lead the green energy transition and will get really rich doing it, to the consternation of many other people. Thank you very much. Is there time for a couple questions?